The topic this evening is how to win an argument fairly. People argue for all sorts of reasons, all sorts of motivations. I think of argument as a method for arriving at the truth. And that includes not just producing logic, starting with premises and arriving at a conclusion, which is sometimes called an argument, but even discussing and debating with others concerning contradictory points of view. That too can be a method for arriving at the truth. In fact, in the Choshen Mishpat, the part of the Shulchan Aruch that deals with civil law and criminal law, when people have a dispute, one method for solving the dispute is this. It's called zabla. Ze borelo echad. Ze borelo echad. You're going to have a tribunal, a court of 3 judges, which is composed as follows. Each of the litigants chooses a judge to represent him, a judge to represent him. Those words should sound funny to you. And then the 2 judges choose a 3rd judge to be the 3rd one on the panel. So the 2 litigants present their cases, and then the judges discuss. And here, 2 out of the 3 judges have a partisan job. This judge is supposed to represent this particular one of the litigants' point of view, and this judge is supposed to represent the other one's point of view. And the 3rd, in case they maintain a disagreement, the 3rd can decide between them. And this is recommended by the commentaries as a way of finding the truth. Because if one is trying to prove the proposition, the other is trying to disprove the proposition, he's looking for every possible way to prove it, or every possible way to disprove it. He'll be very energetic and very thorough, spirited by the competition. It means you're not asking the judges to be impartial. You don't need to ask them to be impartial. 2 of them are not supposed to be impartial, they're supposed to be partial. And since each one of the judges who represents his particular litigant wants to win, if they agree on a 3rd judge, that means the 3rd judge is, to their best of knowledge, impartial, otherwise one of them wouldn't agree. So arguing with one another is a way of finding the truth. Well, that means the first requirement for winning an argument fairly is to want to find the truth, and not to do anything in the argument which would obscure the truth or override the truth. What I want to talk about is avoiding mistakes in logic, which in the course of arguing with one another are easy to fall into. And of course, if I fall into the mistake while arguing with you, it's going to be a mistake that will mean that I win the argument. And vice versa. How we can organize a discussion or an argument, a debate, to minimize those mistakes. Nothing is foolproof, and nothing covers the whole ground, but to minimize those mistakes. There's a particular mistake that I think is very, very widespread. And having been a professional philosopher and having taught at university for 10 years, I come across this many, many times. I want to start by introducing a concept from American law. Maybe it exists in other legal systems as well, but I know it's American law, and that's called the burden of proof. Let's suppose that someone is accused of committing a crime. He's on trial. So you have the district attorney who represents the state, and then you have the defense attorney who represents the accused. What is the job of the prosecutor, district attorney? What is he supposed to try to accomplish? What must he do in order to win the case? The prosecutor must present evidence which demonstrates beyond a reasonable doubt that the accused is guilty. Talk about a criminal prosecution. The prosecutor has to present evidence that demonstrates that the accused is guilty, and the evidence has to be strong enough so that no reasonable doubt can contradict it. Now, restricting it to reasonable doubts is because there are unreasonable doubts also. And there are some people who push for absolute certainty without any possibility of being wrong. That's ruled out. That's not required. It's not required that the prosecutor prove it with absolute certainty, just that his evidence be strong enough to resist any reasonable doubt. Is this vague? Yeah, it's vague. Right. Lots of things in life are vague. That doesn't mean it's empty. It doesn't mean it doesn't work. It may mean that there are some controversial cases. Like many other concepts that we work with, there are black, white, and gray areas. And the gray areas are controversial. That doesn't erase the fact that there are black and white areas where the concept is very useful to determine what the outcome should be. Okay, so the job of the prosecutor is to produce evidence that demonstrates guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. What is the job of the defense attorney? Is the job of the defense attorney to produce evidence that establishes innocence beyond a reasonable doubt? Is that his job? No, that is not his job. So what is his job?
To put down their accusations, I imagine.
Well, close. The job of the defense attorney is to show that the prosecutor has not produced evidence that demonstrates guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. He's failed at his responsibility. In order to do that, all the defense attorney has to do is introduce a reasonable doubt. A reasonable doubt, right? If he introduces a reasonable doubt and the prosecutor can't respond, then the defense attorney wins. I don't know if this is true, but it seems to be, when you have a case, a trial before a jury, and you ask them for their verdict, the two possible verdicts are guilty and not guilty. The other verdict isn't innocent. The other verdict is not guilty. By which he means the prosecutor has not succeeded in demonstrating guilt. If the prosecutor wins, we have very good reason to think he's guilty. If the defense wins, what do we have very good reason to think? No! We have very good reason to think that the prosecutor has not demonstrated his guilt. You have no reason to think he's not guilty. All the defense attorney did was raise a reasonable doubt. That's all. He could still be guilty. Put it in more brutal terms, the defense attorney succeeds in his task. What we should say at the end is, so now we are aware we don't know. We don't know. Maybe he's guilty, maybe he's innocent. We don't know. For the prosecutor to win, we've got to know he's guilty. For the defense attorney to win, we have to, at the end of the discussion, we have to say, we don't know that he's guilty. Doesn't mean we know he's innocent. We don't know anything. Okay. So now, when you're having a discussion about any subject, let's just assume a discussion about which you disagree. So, one says Proposition A is true, the other says Proposition A is false. How are you going to conduct the discussion? So I think what often happens is this guy produces evidence that it's true, this guy produces evidence that it's false, this guy says your evidence doesn't count for this and this reason, this says your evidence doesn't count for this and this reason. Everybody's doing everything all the time. I recommend don't do it that way. I recommend that the two resolve together to do one side at a time. One side at a time. And that would mean, thank you very much, that now this guy thinks that Proposition A is true. Let him take the role of the prosecutor. Let him bear the burden of proof. Let him try to present evidence that A is true beyond a reasonable doubt. During this part of the discussion, all B will do is raise reasonable doubts. That's all. Who has a harder job here? A has a much harder job. A has to convince you that something's true. B doesn't have to convince you of anything except that A's failed. Much, much easier job. But okay, because when you finish this phase of the argument, you're going to switch it. Right? If A succeeds in defending, the first one defends A and produces evidence that implies that A is true beyond a reasonable doubt, then it's over. Then the other guy should accept A and they should go home. If he fails to do that, then the question is still alive, because having failed to prove it doesn't make it wrong. Having failed to prove it just accomplishes failing to prove it. That's all. If you have failed to prove it, at that point you say, well, so I'm back in the doldrums. I don't know, is it true, is it false? He couldn't prove it. That doesn't mean it isn't true. Maybe somebody else could prove it. Maybe there's other evidence we haven't thought of. So at that point you go over to the other guy and say, well, you're convinced that it's false. Let's see if you can prove it's false. He's now going to present evidence which he'll try to convince us that it's false beyond a reasonable doubt. And A will play the other guy will play the role of poking holes in his argument by presenting reasonable doubts. If you do it one at a time, it's very clear whose responsibility is which, and you can much easier to determine who has succeeded in each phase of the discussion. Because otherwise, if you do everything all at the same time, when this guy speaks, half the time he's trying to present evidence that A is true, and half the time, that's the hard job, and half the time he's trying to defend against B's evidence, so to point out that there are doubts. So half the time he's got to present facts and argue they're correct. The other half of the time he's just raising questions, and it's easy to get them confused. This happens all the time. For example, discussions of evolution. And I should just say, my recommendation is, when discussing something with somebody, of course, these are important topics and contentious objects, try to get him to agree that he should be the one to bear the burden of proof first. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Let him bear the burden of proof first. Truthfully, they shouldn't be too difficult. Because if you're talking about evolution, you're talking about the existence of God, you're talking about absolute morality, these people who you'll meet, they know they're right. They know. Because they've got science on their side. Follow the science. And they think they've got philosophy on their side. And they've got rational thought on their side. Right? Especially the ones who scream on campus to drown out the speaker. They definitely have right on their side. They know they're right. Okay. You know you're right. Let me, for the time being, play Socrates. In Plato's dialogues, Socrates comes on. He's phony, but he comes on as, you think you know, let's see if you know. Me, I don't know anything. I'm not part of the discussion. I'm neutral, but you say you know. Well, let's see how you know. So Socrates says, I have no obligations. I have no responsibilities because I'm not saying anything. I'm not making any claim. But you are. I'd say he's lying because but I'm not going to go into that now unless we have extra time at the end. But that's the idea. Let the other guy bear the burden of proof and do the tough job of showing beyond a reasonable doubt that his position is correct, and you take the position of simply poking holes in his argument, with the promise that if indeed he doesn't succeed, then you'll switch sides. Now, for example, someone says, I'm going to show you how it works and how it gets twisted if you don't pay attention to keeping this straight. Someone says, let's take a look at the fossil record and see whether it supports evolution or not. You believe in evolution. You're sure it's right. You're Jerry Coyne. You're Richard Dawkins. So you show me that the fossil record supports evolution. Darwin said there have to be small, smooth transitions between forms. Show me the small, smooth transitions between the forms so I can see them, and we can see that the fossil record supports what your theory says is true. Fine. You look at the fossil record, and it doesn't. It's not a secret. It's known very well. Yes, believers in evolution will lie to you about it, but it is, and the evidence is all there. It's all in the literature. Okay, so you catch him and say, look, let's say the whale is supposed to have evolved from some prehistoric creature, something like a fox. From a fox to a whale. That's not like moving next door. That's a big jump. And it's supposed to have happened in 11 million years. How many changes do you think it would require to go from a fox to a whale? 6? 16? It's thousands and thousands. Especially you're talking about genetic changes. It's thousands and thousands of changes. You say, I don't know how you make it in 11 million years, but you say that's what show me the fossil record. Okay. In the actual fossils that they show you, there are big jumps. As there must be. You would need, 6,000 fossils in between that would do the job. And they just don't have them. Okay. Now, suppose they say something like this. This was Eldridge and Gould in the middle 70s, when they came to the conclusion that the fossil record doesn't show smooth transitions, and they created a theory called punctuated equilibria. Okay, it's very complicated, and later in the structural scientific theory of evolutionary theory, all 1,400 pages of which I read, he goes into some of the problems, and we're all aware of all that stuff. But here's the skeleton. What they say is, yeah, it's true that the fossil record shows jumps, doesn't show smooth transitions, but that's because Darwin was right, and the smooth transitions are what happened, but they happened in such a way that you're not going to find them. They happened in such a way that you're not going to find them. And here, this was the first form of the theory, here's roughly how it works. When you have a very large interbreeding population, genetic changes get drowned out by the vast majority of the population. To get them to spread in the population requires that if it's a sexually reproducing population, then you've got to have the new gene to fit with the genes of the other one. And if they're both recessive, they have to come together simultaneously. It's very unlikely. If you had a small, isolated population, then it could happen, much more probable to happen, and it could happen in the mere blink of an eye, let's say 100,000 years. 100,000 years in geological time is very fast. So let's say you have the plains of Africa, 15 million wildebeests running around and being wild, right? And interbreeding and staying the same. Then let's say there's a thunderstorm, and it lasts for 2 days, and the lightning bolts are flying, and the animals are running around in wild disarray and fear, and about 500 of them run over a junction between two mountains where the wildebeest never naturally go. And when the storm clears, they're in a valley surrounded by mountains, all 500 of them, and they don't know how they got there, and you can't get back. But they're 500. That's a nice sized population. Then they're stuck. Okay, 500, and it's a fairly small valley. It doesn't have enough food to produce thousands and thousands more wildebeest. About 500 is it, and the rest of them are going to die of starvation. So they evolve. In a small, isolated population, genetic changes can spread through the population very quickly. Okay, so the situation stays that way for 100,000 years. During that time, those 500 in the valley are evolving. Their hooves are getting sharper, and their teeth are getting stronger, and their muscles are getting stronger, and they're developing new types of coordination, to dodge those who are attacking them, and so forth and so on. And after 100,000 years, there's an earthquake, and the separation of the valley to the plains cracks open, and now those 500 new, improved wildebeest are let loose on the plains with the old, inferior wildebeest. What's going to happen? The new, improved ones are going to outcompete the old ones, and they're going to replace them. Now, when you go digging for fossils, you're not going to find that little valley, and you're not going to find the sediments that lay down in the 100,000 years. You're going to find the gigantic plains, which is 10,000 times as big as the valley in square miles, and you're going to find the new wildebeest on top and the old wildebeest on the bottom. You're not going to find the thing in between. That's a punctuated equilibria. When you look at the fossil record, you see equilibrium, which means the same, and then a punctuation, different, sizably different, very noticeably different, not smooth. That's what you see, and the reason why it is that way is because over there in that valley, which you didn't find, that's where the smooth transitions were taking place. That's the theory that's supposed to explain the fossil record. So some clever guys said, this is a very funny kind of theory. It's a theory that implies that you won't find evidence for the theory. Is that the kind of theory you want? Is that what gets you merits in science? Not only don't you have evidence, but the theory implies you're not going to find it. Okay, but that was a theory. Now, did anybody feel what happened? Let's go back through it now and look at it from the lens of the logical structure of the argument. I asked the evolutionist, why do you believe what you believe? In particular, show me that the fossils fit the theory. What does he do? He says, well, actually, when you look at the record, they don't, but I can explain why they don't. That's not the same. Explaining why they don't is not the same as showing me. Explaining why they don't is explaining to me why he can't show me. That's not showing me. To put it in simple terms, I want evidence that it's true. He gives me evidence that it's possible. Because maybe there was that valley, and maybe there was that fairly rapid but smooth change. Maybe, but he doesn't show it to me. He's given up the ship. He's supposed to show me it's so, and he shifts to showing me that it's possible. Now, what happens when he shows me that it's possible? If I give in, what he's done is he shifted the burden of proof to me. He's saying, I want you to show me that I'm wrong. You show me that evolution is wrong. Show me that evolution is false. Show me that the fossil record rules it out. And I'll show you it doesn't, because maybe there's that little valley. But that wasn't the game. The game was not that I should show he's false. The game was that he should show that he's true. When he's put in a corner where he can't do that, he subtly shifts the burden of proof onto me. And when I can't argue that there's no such valley, I can't show there's no such valley, then he says, well, see, my theory wins, and therefore what? And therefore I'm right. But that's not what follows. It doesn't follow that he's right. It follows that he's possibly right. He could be right. He might be right. Not that he is right. To show that he is right, he's got to produce actual evidence, not just the possibility of evidence. So I'm sure you didn't hear it as I described it, but now that I'm pointing it out to you, do you see what happened with the burden of proof? I put the burden of proof on him. To bear the burden of proof, he's got to produce enough evidence to survive any reasonable doubt, to show that it's true. When I point out a doubt, he doesn't fill in more evidence. He concocts a theory whereby it's possible that he's right. Not that he is right, but it's possible. I didn't ask for possibilities. Frankly, I'm not interested in a scientist telling me about possibilities. I have an imagination also. I can think things up. I want him to tell me about what is, not what's possible. If he shifts to telling me possibilities, he's failed to bear the burden of proof. But what he does is, no one notices that he has switched the burden of proof. He puts it on me. Then I'm supposed to show there is no such valley. I'm supposed to show that the fossil record proves that he's wrong. I can't do that. And he says, well, see, you couldn't prove I'm wrong, so I guess I'm right. No, that's not logic. If I can't prove you're wrong, that doesn't mean you're right. If I can't prove you're wrong, that just means I can't prove you're wrong. That's all. Doesn't mean any more than that. You might still be wrong. I just can't prove it. Certainly doesn't mean that you're right. Is the example I gave clear? Okay, now this goes on all the time. Let's say we're talking about God. Right? A believer and an atheist. So if they follow my recommendation, the believer says, look, you know you're right. You have science on your side. So you tell me why there is no God beyond a reasonable doubt. Give me your evidence, your argument that shows there is no God beyond a reasonable doubt. And I'll play the role of the defense attorney. I'll try to raise reasonable doubts. Okay. So now, what's he going to do? I have actually seen this in print. Well, where could God be? You know, we're pretty well acquainted with lots of the universe, and with using astronomy, we've can check far reaches of the universe, and we haven't found them. So, that's Very good reason to think there is no God. So the believer says back, did we claim that God was in Alpha Centauri? It's hiding behind a star? You found him in an atom or something? That where we located God? That where we believers place God? That's where you looked and didn't find him? The first Soviet astronaut who went in orbit around the Earth said, I'm above the Earth, I can see the whole Earth, I don't see God here. Okay, fine, you don't. But we didn't predict you would anyway, so what? So then the atheist will say, well, there's a lot of evil in the world, and the God you believe in is all good, so there shouldn't be evil. Good, that's the problem of evil. There's gigantic literature on that, and it's pretty well accepted that it's not an adequate proof that there is no God. So he runs through his standard thing. Science can explain everything without God. That's a very common thing to say. Science can explain everything without God. So the believer says, okay, let's suppose that we're correct. It isn't correct, but let's suppose we're correct. All that shows is I don't need to assume God to explain anything. Maybe not, but does that mean he doesn't exist? Just because I don't need to assume him in order to fill my picture of the world, therefore he doesn't exist? What's one thing got to do with the other? Why should his existence be dependent upon my need to use him in my theories to get my theories to work? Why should that? He doesn't depend upon me, doesn't depend on my theories, doesn't depend upon my thoughts or anything. All you could say, if the claim were correct, it's not needed to explain anything, it's not needed to make any theories work, is to say, I don't need him to make my theories work. Maybe you could say, well, look, isn't that where you would be looking for evidence for him? Places where you need him to make your theories work? Okay, suppose I agree to that. So then the atheist says, well, then that means you're not going to find any evidence for him. Okay, but that wasn't my job. You were supposed to bear the burden of proof. You were supposed to present me with evidence that would be beyond a reasonable doubt. The fact that I'm not going to find evidence for my side doesn't do anything for your side. In the yeshivas, they put it this way: a kasha is not a raya. If you ask a kasha on my position, raise an objection to my position, that doesn't prove you're right. We could both be wrong. Some third thing could be correct. So here again, it's where there's an illicit shift in the burden of proof. It's very, very difficult to prove atheism. If you have, let's say, evolutionary theory would explain the development of life. It doesn't. It's shambles. It's full of mistakes. But suppose it did. The standard theistic response is, that's the way God did it. God ran those processes so that it would come out with the existence of man. You say there's a lot of wastage in it? Yeah, God did that to cover up. Show me I'm wrong. I'm raising a doubt in your evidence. You're saying that evolution explains it, and I say, even if it explained it, still God could be there doing it behind the scenes. You're supposed to be showing reason to deny the existence of God beyond a reasonable doubt. Well, here's a reasonable doubt. Your theory explains it, and God did it that way. You have nothing to say against that. So when he gets frustrated, what he does is, well, you believe in God, show me there is a God. At that point, you ought to throw down the red flag and say, no, that's a foul. Sorry, that's not my responsibility. First admit you failed. First admit you were not able to produce adequate reason that God doesn't exist. Now, I think there's a very important psychological point here. Remember, he starts off, he knows. He's got all of modern science and all of modern thought and all the sophistication of the left-wing politics, all the rest of that. He knows that we're wrong. If you force him to acknowledge that he hasn't got adequate reason for his position, that'll take him down a peg or two. If he's honest at all, he'll have to say, well, I thought I knew, and the people who are telling me these things think they know, but right now, I don't see why they say that. I don't see what good reason they have for saying that. That's big progress. Because before you do that, he's not open to hear anything else because he's sure he's right. If he's not sure he's right anymore, then he may be open to hear an alternative point of view. That's why I like to start that way. So that's the way it is with atheism. Another area where this comes up all the time is the objective values. That certain values are objective, they're right, they're true, they're real. Someone who denies that is making a mistake. It's not just an alternative point of view, or alternative culture, or alternative reality, or alternative truth, and so forth and so on. It's just wrong. And of course, they're sure that that's crazy. That's just prejudice. It's imperialist. It's misogynist. It's, all the ists, they get you in trouble. It's also fattening. So I said, fine, okay, you're convinced that this is absolutely nuts. You believe that there's no objective value. Let me hear your reasons in favor of that. What reasons do you have? So he'll say, well, different cultures all over the world at different periods in history had very different values. Well, first of all, they didn't, but leave that aside. Let's say they did. So what? Why does that mean there isn't one that's right? Just because different times and places, different people have had different values. At different times and places, people had different ideas about whether the earth is flat or round, or what the origin of the earth is, or why people get sick, or what you can do to turn base metals into gold. And people have had lots and lots of different ideas. Does that mean there's no right idea? Just because people have lots and lots of different ideas? Surely, people go through periods where there are lots and lots of different ideas because they don't know the subject well, either because they don't have enough information or because no one has thought up the key concepts that are needed to describe the subject in the appropriate way. As one philosopher put it, ethics has not yet had its Newton. What Sir Isaac Newton did for astronomy and for physics, everyone else afterwards uses his method. They disagree with the results, but they use his method. That's why you start in school teaching Newton, and then teaching the changes in Newton. Ethics hasn't had its Newton yet. So the fact that there's disagreement just means that the state of play is very primitive. The example that I give, which I think I mentioned to you on a different occasion, studies of consciousness. Daniel Dennett wrote a book called Consciousness Explained. It was reviewed in the Journal of Philosophy. The reviewer said the book was misnamed. It should have been called Consciousness Ignored. Because in 350 pages, he didn't address the subject. That's a pretty wide disagreement, wouldn't you say? They can't agree on what the subject is. Should you therefore conclude that there is no such thing as consciousness, there's nothing to study, it's all a mistake, it's just subjective? Is that what you should conclude? I hope not. Dennett didn't think so. What you should conclude is that it's a very hard subject, and our thinking about it is very primitive, and it requires a lot more work to put it on a solid foundation. We did it with other sciences. From 300 years ago and back, no one had a clue why the stars shine or the sun shines. No one had a clue. They had all sorts of weird ideas, and no one had a clue. That means there's no reason why it shines? No reality to it shining? Of course not. It just means that they were very primitive in their understanding of it. So he says that the reason there are no absolute values is because there's disagreement about values over time and space. So what? That doesn't mean that there's no truth about the matter. There's not even a method for investigating. We can't even agree on the method for investigating it. That's true for consciousness also. That's the point. Dennett thought he had investigated and explained it, and the other guy said he hadn't even addressed the subject. That doesn't mean there's no subject. So, but what else do you have to say? There was a series about 20 years ago called Debates in Philosophy. This subject was debated by Gilbert Harmon of Princeton and Judith Jarvis Thompson of MIT. She happened to be Jewish. And He took the position in favor of relativism on the grounds of so much disagreement about ethical issues that goes back thousands of years, and no progress has been made on some anyway. No progress has been made, and that show that therefore there's nothing there to be discovered, and it's all subjective. She made a very interesting, I think, very important remark. She said, if you look at one-dimensional cases, if you look at ethical questions where there's only one ethical consideration that applies, there's almost unanimity. All the cases that are difficult and controversial are cases where two or more competing ethical elements are in play. So, for example, let's suppose someone made a promise, and now he has two courses of action. In one course of action, he keeps the promise. In the other course of action, he breaks the promise. And there's no other difference between them. Not in money, and not in time, and not in effort, and not in pleasure, and not in justice. They're exactly the same, just that one keeps the promise and one doesn't. Is there going to be controversy about what he ought to do? Surely he ought to keep the promise, right? Because it costs absolutely nothing competing with it. And pleasure, and saving life, and so forth and so on. If there's only one moral consideration, there's near unanimity of what to do. Well, that, she said, makes it sound like there is something real here. Our problem is that when we have competing moral considerations, we don't know how to weigh them. We don't know how to find a common currency. We can say this works, it gets 17 points, this gets 14 points, so this one's more important. Okay, so that's a problem in the field. It doesn't prove there's no field. So, the guy who's saying that that there is no objective values, if I ask him to bear the burden of proof, he certainly can't do it. Certainly, a reasonable doubt that given everything that you've said, there may still be objective values. At this point, when he feels that conclusion coming around the corner, what he says one way or another is, well, if you think there are objective values, prove it. Let me hear your argument that it's true. If you fall for the bait, which you shouldn't, that's when you should throw down the red flag and say, foul. You're bearing the burden of proof. Until we finish with that, don't switch it to me. Do you agree now that you have not been able to bear the burden of proof? That you don't have satisfactory reason for thinking there are no absolute values? If you get him to agree to that, you've made a tremendous progress. Because now he has to admit that he's in doubt. He can't brand you as primitive and prejudiced because you believe in them, because he hasn't got a good reason for denying you. Only when that has happened do you then switch the burden of proof. And if you fail also, he can't chuckle in victory and say, well, you couldn't prove it's true, so it must be false. What he should say is, you couldn't prove it's true, I can't prove it's false, so we're both in ignorance. We both don't know what the truth is. And that's correct. Now, so if you keep it straight, then you can draw the conclusion in the first half, and you can work on drawing the conclusion in the second half, and then you can hopefully agree on the results of the discussion without falling into this trap of switching the burden of proof. There's one thought here which I have come across, people talk about, and I can't make it plausible, to me anyway, but since they talk about it, I will say it. There's some people who say like this: if the discussion is about whether or not something exists, one says it does exist, and the other says it doesn't exist, like say the existence of God, then the two positions aren't equal. The default position is there is no God. You want to prove God exists, you prove it. The burden of proof belongs only on one side, not on the other side. And therefore, if the believer tries to prove the existence of God beyond a reasonable doubt and fails, then the atheist is justified in saying, therefore, I'm right that there is no God. Because you're claiming something exists, and I'm claiming something doesn't exist. The two claims are not equal in status. The default, when you know nothing, is to say it doesn't exist. And then only afterwards can you say it exists if you have adequate argument that it exists? Well, I don't know. I find it very difficult to even work up an intuitive sympathy for that. In my training as a philosopher and as a logician, if you take a position, you owe a reason. If you say something is correct, you owe a reason why you think it's correct. You can't just arbitrarily decide that you believe that. You can do it, but you can't play philosophy that way. Whether your position is that something does exist or that it doesn't exist, in order to be credited with responsibility and rationality, you need to have a reason why you think it's correct. Otherwise, simply admit you don't know what's correct. Makes no difference whether your position is it exists or it doesn't exist. Let's take a couple of examples. And by the way, whether something exists or not often can be phrased in another way which wouldn't have this implication. Let's talk about whether the sample is pure or it has impurities in it. So who's talking about existence and non-existence? Well, the simple thing to say is impurities. You talk whether impurities are there or impurities aren't there. So according to this guy, the one who says impurities aren't there is the default position, and the one who says impurities are there has to show that they're there. And if he doesn't show that they're there, then the right thing to do is to say that they aren't there. Boy, would that make it easy to sell a pure product. You prove there are impurities. Go find them. You didn't find them? It's pure. I charge you for a pure product. No one's going to do that. Excuse me. You're selling it as pure. Prove that it's pure. Give me good reason to think that it's pure. Give me good reason to think there aren't any impurities in it. There's no default position. Somebody says there are impurities, wants to sue the guy, show that there are impurities. Somebody wants to sell it as pure, and I'm going to trust him that it's safe. Let him show me that it's pure. There aren't any impurities in it. There's no default position here. Same with they're chasing the criminal, and he runs into a back alley where, I come from Baltimore, where there are back alleys behind all the houses where they put the garbage. He runs in the back alley, and we get to the back alley, and he's gone. Where is he? Maybe he ran into a house, he's hiding in the house. Maybe he ran out between the houses, out in the fields. I don't know. Should I go home? So according to this guy, well, you have no good evidence that he's in your house, so go home. Because you know he's not there. Because that's the default position, that it's empty. I don't think so. I don't think that's a good idea. I want to know that somebody went through my house carefully and checked before I go home. The fact that it's this one say he does exist, that one says he doesn't exist. If I'm going to accept either one or act on either one, I want good reason for it. I don't say that one's default and if you don't know anything, you take that as correct. There's absolutely no reason for that whatsoever. So, that being the case, the idea of the burden proof is extremely important. Maybe I'll make one more remark, and then I will, and then if there are questions, we'll finish for the evening. About, I guess, a year and a half ago, when Amy Barrett was being quizzed by the Senate on her nomination to the Supreme Court, I saw an interchange between her and Cory Booker, the senator from New Jersey, and it illustrated for me in a very stark manner how you can be talking at cross purposes. I think they knew they were talking cross purposes, but they had to have the public debate. And the question is how many people realized that that's what's going on. She's nominated to the Supreme Court. So he said to her, there's a whole literature of investigations that have been made as to how much blacks suffer from the so-called justice system. And he mentioned various titles and the kinds of conclusions that they drew. He kept asking her, have you read this? Have you read this? Have you read this? She chose not to answer. And he said to her, well, I'm asking you, as a senator, you're being nominated to the Supreme Court, what are you going to do for the persecuted black population? She said, if I'm appointed to the Supreme Court, my job is to interpret the law. In particular, if a law is passed by the legislature and the Supreme Court is to decide whether to strike it down or not, it does it on the basis of its best understanding of the Constitution. And according to constitutional law and constitutional history, I'll have to make a decision whether it's compatible with the Constitution or not, and that's how I'll make my decision. He said, but what are you going to do for black people who are being disadvantaged? I thought, hey, what's going on here? Like, he's asking a question and she's answering, but they're not talking to each other. And that's quite right. They weren't talking to each other. Because you see, Booker, together with other people of his political persuasion, don't believe in the Constitution. They don't believe in the laws. They don't believe in the institutions of government. They believe people are suffering, people are being victimized, people are being disadvantaged. You will have power. How will you use your power to help them? And the truth be damned. I thought to myself, wow, there's a really fundamental difference here. That's where the rioters come from. They absorb that attitude. The laws don't matter, and the institutions don't matter. If it's an injustice, write the injustice anyway with a firebomb, so let it be a firebomb. It was like, so there I saw what it means to be having a discussion, but coming to it from such different points of view that there's no communication between the two sides. The same thing is true if A says to B, prove you're right, and B says, well, it could be this way, and if you don't think so, show I'm wrong. That's just as wrong-headed. Because to challenge the other guy to refute you is not to show that you're right. That's not showing you're right. You can only show you're right by positive evidence that you are right. That's why Socrates used to take this know-nothing position. Meno comes along and he's on his way to court to prosecute his father for murder. Socrates says, wow, you're going to prosecute your father for murder? Boy, you must know a lot about good and evil, about justice, to undertake such a drastic thing. What happened? His father tied up a slave because the slave disobeyed. He said, and he went off to do something. He said, I'll be back in a while. And he got delayed, and by the time he came back, the slave was dead. Meno said, you tied him up. It's a slave, and his father, like... So Socrates says, tell me, what do you think justice is? And what do you think good and evil are? What do you think truth is? And so on and so on. And of course, Socrates ties him up in knots. And at the end, Meno says, oh, well, time's running out. I got to run to court. Sorry, see you later. And Meno is thereby exposed, like much of the Athenian society, to people who cannot give an adequate explanation of what they're doing and do it anyway. Now here's the secret. I forget where I read this many years after I was in graduate school. I didn't teach Plato. I wasn't into ancient philosophy, but we did read it. And this would be relevant in the kind of discussion we were talking about as well. Socrates is not innocent. Socrates is not it's not as if he has no commitments. Because when Socrates asks Meno to explain and to demonstrate he's right, Socrates uses certain rules of demonstration. He has certain criteria. Do it my way, Meno. Present the evidence I think is relevant. Present arguments that I think are valid, or else you lose. You could challenge Socrates on his epistemology. Who says that's the only evidence? Who says that's the right way to present the evidence? Who says that your criterion for winning the argument is the correct criterion for winning the argument? Socrates does have commitments, which could be questioned. So I don't know whether Plato was aware of that and just decided to overlook it, or whether he himself was really misled about it. So that's why I talk about shifting the argument around the other way. And when I say to the believer in science or the believer in philosophy or whatever it is, give me your arguments, and he can't answer my arguments, one of the things he could do is to say, why are you rejecting my arguments? Because they don't fit your picture of what a good argument is? Where does your picture come from? There he's responding to my critique. I claim I have a reasonable doubt, and he says it's not a reasonable doubt. There he's attacking my doubt. That's permissible. When I talk about the person who has burden of proof, the subject is, are there reasonable doubts or aren't there reasonable doubts? I present a doubt, I present it as reasonable, and he says it's not reasonable. That's perfectly appropriate. I have to explain to him why I think it's reasonable. So we're not anymore talking about whether the proposition is true or false. We're talking about the adequacy of the evidence that he's presenting, which is precisely what we ought to be talking about. He should be presenting the evidence, and I'm attacking the evidence as not being adequate, or being misleading, or being misunderstood in some way. That's where a substantive disagreement between the two of us can arise. But that's not about the proposition in question. The proposition in question, are there objectively correct values, or is there a God, or is evolution reasonable? That's going to be strictly one-sided. Yeah.
Is the burden of proof always, in a legal proceeding, I guess, on the side of the person who is giving the argument, like he's, what do you call it?
No. Well, you see, you said a legal proceeding. There are two types of legal proceedings. They're criminal and civil. In a criminal case where a person is accused of a crime, the burden of proof is on the prosecutor to show beyond a reasonable doubt that he committed the crime. And the defense attorney doesn't have a burden of proof. He has a burden of disproof. All he has to show is that the prosecutor didn't give a proof. But in a civil case, it goes on probability. Which is more probable? That this guy is at fault or this guy is at fault? And there it's 50-50. So there each side presents evidence to raise the probability of its side. And the determination has to be made whether, which side the preponderance of probability is on. That's why O.J. Simpson was acquitted in the criminal trial and was convicted in the civil trial. Because for the criminal trial, let's say in round numbers, you'd have to present enough evidence to make it 85% probable that he's guilty. And in the civil case, you have to present enough evidence to be 51% or 50% plus epsilon. That's all. And then he has to pay. So the criteria are very different in the two cases. When you take a legal proceedings, it's very important to distinguish between a criminal legal proceedings and a civil legal proceedings. I was talking about criminal proceedings. Okay, I hope that helps. There are lots of other things to say about it, but I hope that helps to clarify the way the discussion goes and to avoid this illicit shifting of the burden of proof, and will help people arrive at more accurate conclusions. And if you're taking at the outset, the defensive side, it's much more likely that you'll be successful because it's much easier just to show the other guy failed to prove his case than it is to prove your case. So if you start with getting him to try to prove his case, and you succeed in showing that he hasn't proved it, you've already had a victory. It's a weak victory because you had a weak job, but it's a victory. After that, you can try to do the hard job on your own self. Yeah.
How come you automatically don't assume it's a civil case where you have to just show your percent of interest? How come you automatically assume it's this?
I'm sorry, I'm not getting you.
How come you? What's the reason we assume? I can't tell you it's a case where the burden of proof and then you disprove it and then it switches both ways.
In a civil case, they have competing claims. In a criminal case, there are no competing claims. There's only one claim. You committed a crime. Here, there's who started the fight? A knocked B out. Who started the fight? A says B started, B says A started. No, it's one or the other, and whichever one it is, that'll determine who's right and who's wrong. Right? You don't have to do it beyond reasonable doubt. Indeed, usually in a case like that, both sides can't be demonstrated beyond a reasonable doubt. You're not going to get 85% that A started it. You're not going to get 85% that B started it. And they'll all be left in limbo. Nothing will happen. Yeah.
At some point, the atheist is going to try and flip the script and say, well, you proved there's God. But at some point, we're going to want to present our arguments.
Yeah, of course.
Right. So this is just, listen, my friend, you believe what you want to believe, and I wish you well. It's just not my job. I'm just asking you to establish your credibility.
So those two things that you just said are not compatible. If I'm asking him to establish his credibility, I am not saying to him, you're my friend and you can believe whatever you want to believe. I'm not saying that at all. What I'm saying is, I'm saying either present evidence for your credibility or give it up. I'm not happy that he's believing something for no reason, no adequate reason. He's being unreasonable if he believes something for no adequate reason. I'm not preaching tolerance here. On the contrary. You say you know, defend it. If you can't defend it, give it up.
But at no point am I trying to prove there's a God.
Again, I said over and over again, this discussion has two phases. But the phases have to be kept distinct. The first phase is he tries to prove his atheism is correct. He gives his reasons. I try to poke hole in his reasons. And if I can raise adequate doubts about his reasons, the end of phase one is he admits I can't defend atheism. And then there comes the second phase. I'll present my arguments that there is a God. He'll try to poke holes in my reasons. He may succeed. At the end of which we should both say, neither of us knows who's right. We just admit that we're both ignorant. But for him, that's a big step forward, because he's sure he's right. He's sure he's right. He's got the whole contemporary atheistic society on his side. He's got the whole of the left politically on his side. He's sure he's right. The other guys are superstitious and foolish and ignorant and bigoted and illogical. It's a gigantic revelation to him when he finds out that he can't defend himself. It made a big step of progress, and that his willingness to listen to you, as long as he's convinced that he's right, he's talking to a savage, to a primitive. He's not even listening with both ears. Like, listen to this pit put for, these guys don't know what they're talking about. They're just prejudiced savages.
So we're just trying to get him to listen and be open-minded.
Yes, if he's logical, he's willing to be fair, his mind will change drastically. Well, I don't really know. I remember when I went through this. As I was brought up, I wasn't religious, and I was in college, and they were all liberals, and those days, the nature-nurture pendulum was on the side of nature. Everything is how you're programmed. Everything is how your society trains you, and your parents train you, and that's why there's no difference between men and women, and the whole thing, right? So I was talking to the present Boston Rabbi of Jerusalem. I'm older than he is, but so he was like, 13 or so, and I was in university. I'm telling him this stuff. It's all environmental. And he says to me, why do you say that? What reason do you have for saying that? How do they convince you that that's true? I thought, that's an interesting question. Why am I saying that? What evidence did they present that it's correct? That is what we would say today, there's no genetic component? Nothing's genetic? Isn't the chief difference between you and a mouse your genes? Is it possible that genes have no effect on these things? I thought, hey, wait a minute. They've told me this. They've talked about this. We yelled this as slogans, and so on, and they didn't give me evidence. Something's wrong here. These are supposed to be the smart guys. These are supposed to be the guys who study, the guys who know, the scientists and so on. They pushed this off on me without any evidence? I think I better think about this 6 times before I continue to pledge allegiance. That's when I started to become critical and start to think, where's it coming from? What kind of evidence do they have? And I found out the nature-nurture pendulum swings back about every 15 years. For a while it's all nature, and then for a while it's all nurture. The Minnesota twin studies, where the twins separated at birth, and they turn out to have the same political opinions, and they have the same pets with the same names, and so on. And say, it's all environment. Yeah, right. So that's when I began to make a shift.